Underwater levels are basically an entirely different genre of video game from ground levels. Rather than being a platformer that draws inspiration from Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., the underwater levels have much more in common with an earlier Nintendo game, Balloon Fight. Swimming in Mario is very similar to moving through the air in Balloon Fight. Considering this game was made by many of the same people who worked on Super Mario Bros., this likely isn't just a coincidence. They had an entire game's worth of experience in making this kind of movement fun before repurposing it for Super Mario Bros. Underwater levels have a lot in common, especially with Balloon Fight's Balloon Trip mode, both in terms of movement and in terms of dodging some randomly generated stage hazards. Going back even further than Balloon Fight, we get to a game called Joust. This game was released in 1982 and was very clearly a big influence to the team at Nintendo. In both games, you defeat flying enemies by bumping them from the top and then hitting them while they're on the ground. The stage layout from Joust was also the layout used for the arcade game Mario Bros. Joust and Mario Bros. Have a lot in common. They take place in a single arena, and the goal is to defeat as many waves of enemies as possible. With Balloon Fight as experience and Joust as inspiration and/or competition, they were very familiar with this type of gameplay. That's probably why they were able to include this type of play on top of the already existing normal game and not have it feel rushed or tacked on. There are only 2 full underwater levels in the game, 2 optional routes of other levels, and 1 short segment in the final castle. Despite how seldomly these sections appear, I think they're one of the most memorable parts of the game, and a development team with a different history probably wouldn't have been able to do as good of a job. Despite how different moving underwater is from moving on land, there's enough in common with the normal movement physics that despite almost being a change in genre, it still feels like the same game. This is probably because the rules of horizontal movement through the water are the exact same as horizontal movement through the air. The difference is that each new swim motion caused by pressing the A button counts as a new jump, so it's possible to switch movement gears when not on the ground. In fact, it's only possible to switch movement gears if you're not on the ground. Your maximum walking and running speed underwater is 1100. Pretty slow. Like jumping, swimming has a regular gravity, a temporary altered gravity caused by holding down the A button while moving up the screen, and an initial upwards velocity caused by each A press. The values for these 3 variables depend on where you are in the water. There are 3 types of underwater areas: normal, which is most of an underwater level, the surface zone, which is the top area of the level, and whirlpool zones, which exist above and 1 square on either side of certain pits. The initial upward velocity for regular water is 1800, with an altered gravity of D0 and a falling gravity of A0. So it's an inverse of the normal system. The altered gravity that you have while rising is actually much heavier than your falling gravity. The effect is that you have a burst of upward momentum that quickly runs out because of the high weight, but once you actually start moving down, you're falling at a slow, steady pace that feels like sinking. The surface zone also has an initial upward velocity of 1800. This can make it a little bit easier to dodge things sometimes, but it doesn't really matter much in practice. It mostly seems to be there to add a sense of authenticity to the movement, rather than for any gameplay reason. I have to say, it's a very nice touch to have in a game. There are plenty of other games with water levels, but I can't think of many that actually take depth into account at all when swimming. It's a small detail, but I think it adds a lot to the feel of the game. Finally, there are the whirlpool zones. I'm not sure if these are actually meant to be whirlpools or just water pressure or some other kind of force, but for simplicity's sake, let's just call them whirlpool zones. The physics for these are weird. In addition to sucking you downward, they actually affect your horizontal movement a little bit. When in a whirlpool zone, you are moved exactly 1 pixel closer to the center of the zone every other frame. Since the game moves at 60 frames per second, you'll get moved 30 pixels in 1 second, about the distance of 2 blocks a second. As for how they affect your vertical physics, your initial upward velocity for a swim motion is 1000. Your altered gravity is 40, and your falling gravity is 90. But there are some weird additional rules to how this works. For example, everywhere on land, air, and sea, your maximum upward and downward speed is 4800, except for whirlpool zones, where the maximum up or down speed is 1800. Also, an additional 100 is added to your current gravity, regardless of if it's altered or regular. I assume this is added outside of the normal formula so that if you float into the whirlpool zone from a previous A press, you can feel the effect immediately rather than waiting until you press A again to apply the changes. Also, just to refresh on how vertical movement works, your velocity determines how many pixels, subpixels, etc. up or down you move. Each frame that passes, this velocity value changes based on your current gravity. In whirlpool zones, however, downward velocity has extra rules applied to it that upward velocity doesn't. Your de facto velocity when moving down is actually 2 times your velocity plus gravity. As you can imagine, this increases your de facto velocity pretty quickly, which is probably why the speed cap is there. Without that cap to stop your accelerated sinking, you'd hit the point of no return very quickly. However, keep in mind that even with the cap, velocity is still doubled, which means your max downward velocity here is going to be double what you can do going upward. If you're moving down fast enough, pressing A once, sometimes twice, may not move you upwards at all due to the decreased initial velocity value. It might just slow down your descent. These parts of the game encourage that sort of twitchy, button-mashing gameplay I mentioned earlier. On their own, they aren't too bad, but if you happen to get boxed in by some enemies and need to wait for an opening, they can get pretty stressful. Fear of drowning and of deep water you can't see the bottom of is pretty common, and these vortexes seem to be one of the things in the game that consistently get people most excited. It's really the only time control over your character is taken away from the player. Sure, you fight momentum when you're trying to pull back from a bad jump, but that's a result of player action. These areas merge a sense of fear of the unknown, of uncontrollability, and of twitchy, panicky button presses being a necessity. All of this combines to make for a very unique, very exciting threat to the player. If you're in a whirlpool zone and a surface zone, then you operate under both effects at once. There's not too much for me to say about this, except that it's yet another element that adds variety to movement, and that it enforces the idea of higher being safer in these areas, which actually adds a bit of contrast from the bloopers, who are often, but not always, safer to be below. As you can see, a lot of the underwater elements take advantage of the player having more control than usual over their verticality. The camera is something the player has some control over, just like almost everything else in the game. In the later levels, it's not uncommon for the player to try and push the camera along by backing up to the left edge and tiptoeing forward until the camera starts to move. This is an extremely cartoony thing to do, and ties player actions and character movement into the cartoony, goofy, and somewhat surreal world of the game. It also makes for a surprisingly effective pacing tool, with the player finicking around with the camera and inching it forward so they aren't blindly jumping off the side of the screen and potentially killing themselves. The player is kept busy without actually making much progress through the stage, so then when they start moving again, there's a greater emphasis on that speed provided by the contrast. The times where you actually have to stop and inch the camera along are few. It's usually only done if the player themselves decide to slow down and try to approach whatever is coming next more cautiously. Because this function of the camera is so dependent on the player themselves deciding to do it, it doesn't feel frustrating. It actually feels a little funny to fuss around with the camera like this, bordering on frustration because you're trying to get it just right, but not actually becoming annoying. So in addition to slowing down the game's pacing for a bit, it also adds a sense of comedy to the movement. Once again, I would like to stress that this isn't something the game itself tries to force upon you. Because of how the camera follows Mario, if you can't actually see any platforms ahead, it's usually just because of where you happen to stop, which means when this does come up, it's more incidental than anything. The rest of the time, it's the player using a tool they're given to try and outsmart the game. Not being able to see too far ahead may actually be one of the most important elements of the game's design. If you were to play the game in a widescreen mode with everything rendering ahead of you earlier than it normally would, you would have much more time to react to everything. A huge part of the game's appeal is its hyperactivity, fast pace, and its, if you'll excuse me for using what sounds like a marketing phrase, heart-pounding action. For much of the early game, the pacing is decided by the player, with the exception of the timer. As you progress further, obstacles and hazards become denser and more dangerous, levels get longer, and the timer becomes more of a threat. The game more often enforces a faster pace, and in doing so, keeps things lively and interesting. This sense of danger and excitement would be significantly reduced if you could see everything that's coming. Running through a level as fast as possible just wouldn't be as fun if there wasn't the possibility of being taken by surprise and having to react quickly. It may not make much sense that Mario can't see further than the player can, and so it could be argued that this is a divide between the player and player character. At worst, it could even be called immersion breaking. But because the game world is so cartoony and strange and surreal, and because this is emphasized by the way the player can pull the camera forward, The blind spot ahead of the camera feels like a natural extension of the cartoony world and the game's internal rules. Many other platformers like Mega Man, Castlevania, or Shovel Knight have a much slower pace than Super Mario Bros., and so don't run into the issue of reacting to off-screen hazards while running. Other platformers, for example Super Meat Boy, have a much more zoomed out view, and are able to have a high sense of speed without restricting the player's vision. Knowing that something could appear from the right side of the screen at any moment and that you'll have to react quickly just provides a different sense of speed, risk, and adrenaline than those other games provide. Super Mario Bros. Is not unique in this regard, but it's worth noting that this is the context within which everything in the game is presented. These elements can still be present in a game with a wider view, but the sense of risk decreases the more time you give the player to react. It's understandable that not all players will like this approach. Some will think you deserve ample time to react even at fast speeds. Personally, I think this makes the game as a whole feel more dynamic, since your speed has a greater influence on your experience within the game. The checkpoints in the first Super Mario Bros. Are all completely invisible, and there is absolutely no tell whatsoever whenever you pass one. Most of the longer levels will have at least one, but you won't know where it is or even if you've passed it unless you die. Obviously, the trade-off there isn't worth it, and since you never really know if you've passed a checkpoint or not, there's never a decrease in tension like there is in games where a visual checkpoint tells you that you've got a safety net if you screw up. This maintains that sense of risk and excitement and heart-pounding action that I keep bringing up. It's also worth noting that none of the castle levels have a checkpoint. Some of these are the longest levels in the game, but you'll have to start from the very beginning every time you die. These are the only level types that never have checkpoints. Even sky and underwater levels have them. This is just a minor thing that really helps to set castle levels apart from regular ones, even more than unique hazards and mostly unbreakable bricks already do. Difficulty in general is one of the most subjective elements of a game. I've talked about the way Super Mario Bros. Is tougher on the player than later games in the series, and how the punishment and risk of a game over affects the game's feel and pacing. But while I wouldn't call Super Mario Bros. An easy game, without cheat codes, it's really not a particularly hard one either, at least compared to most games of the time. While you're meant to get at least a few game overs on your road towards the end, you do seem like you're meant to get to the end of the game eventually. This was a big difference from the game's competitors. As evidence for my claim that players were meant to eventually beat the game, just look at its sequel to Lost Levels to see how difficult levels made for the original physics engine for Super Mario Bros. Can actually be. Even the final levels on the more difficult loop of Super Mario Bros. Are easier than anything you'll find by the time you reach World 3 in Lost Levels, maybe even before that. If you want evidence within the first game itself, just look at the staircase leading up to the end level flagpole. Climbing this staircase at maximum running speed, without bumping into a wall and stopping, is probably harder than any mandatory challenge the game ever throws at you. I've known plenty of people who can beat the game, but few of them can ever climb the staircase at maximum speed without stopping. While this might just be because the game never demands you learn how to do this, having the same layout, or almost the same layout, at the end of every level should give you plenty of practice. Despite this, it's actually pretty hard for casual players, even ones who have beaten the second loop. I've beaten Lost Levels multiple times, but not even I can do this right every time I try. It's an effective way to remind the player they've got room to improve without really punishing them for it. The game never demands mastery of its systems, only a certain baseline of adequate skill. This is something that has remained true for almost the entire Mario series. To this day, you can beat almost everything in a Mario game pretty easily, with only optional or self-imposed challenges ever demanding a very high level of skill. But while the game sort of taunts you with this, a player can still feel good about themselves for just making it to the end, without feeling an obligation to do more. The following clip is from an interview on the YouTube channel Eurogamer. If you haven't watched it and you're interested enough in Mario to have sat through this whole thing, then I highly recommend checking it out. You can find a link in the description, but for now I'd like to draw focus to a certain clip.
本当に止まるとアクションゲームとして気持ちよくないので止まったままで滑ってるんです。でそれがこのただの絵が重量感を持ってイメージできるためにやってるいろんな処理でそういう細かいところをシリーズごとに
Super Mario Bros. Was not the first game with good physics. To say it was would do a great disservice to games like Joust, Defender, or even earlier Nintendo titles. But it was one of the first games with good physics where you control a human character. All of the actions this character performs are ones the average person can too. So while other games might simulate flying a spaceship or jousting on an ostrich, Super Mario Bros. And its predecessors, Mario Bros. And Ice Climber, were some of the first to have such dynamic human movement. Having a main character perform acts as relatable as running, jumping, swimming, and throwing has a very natural, understandable feel to it. This is the kind of thing that helps establish a link between the player and player character. In a modern context, this isn't exactly unique. Most video game protagonists are human, or at least human-shaped. The reasoning for this is pretty obvious. It's the easiest thing for the average person to relate to. But even today, a lot of protagonists will do things that the average person just can't do. We might imagine what it's like to wave your hands around and shoot lightning out of them, but there's no real-world experience or memories to connect that action to. And while the average person can't jump 30 feet high, most people do at least know what it feels like to jump. We don't know what it feels like to shatter bricks with our hands, but the idea of punching upward, or just bumping your head depending on how you see it, is easy to understand on a sensory level. The only really unrelatable action Mario ever performs in this game is throwing fireballs, but the animation emphasizes the throwing of a ball rather than just having fire fly out of his palm. So even this supernatural ability is framed in a relatable, and very playful, context. Having the actions be playful is yet another component of the game that helps establish a mood through movement. Just about everything Mario does is something that it's easy to see a kid do while he or she is running around playing with other kids. I haven't talked at all about climbing in this game, and that's because there really isn't much to it. You can switch from side to side, climb up or down, or drop off by pressing jump. If you want more exact information about speed values, you can see all of that in a link below leading to Jdaster64's write-up of the physics. What is notable about climbing, though, is what it brings on a conceptual level. When a game has a high emphasis on the feeling of bodily movement, showing a character perform different kinds of movements can help maintain focus on that aspect. Climbing is a tiny, tiny part of this game, but when you see it, I think it triggers an impulse in some part of your brain, the part that's familiar with what climbing something feels like. Seeing the character switch between climbing, walking, jumping, crouching, running, sliding, swimming, falling, bouncing, throwing, riding elevators, all of these help to maintain a sense of movement most players will be familiar with, and a sense of play. Shigeru Miyamoto was a graphic designer before he went into games. He's got a background in visual arts. He also seems to be a fan of animation. It's well known Donkey Kong was originally planned to be a Popeye game, and he stated that the plot of Zelda 2 was inspired by Disney's Sleeping Beauty. From the same interview with Eurogamer, he says,
ドンキーコングの時もアニメーションを作りながらゲームを作ると誰もやってなかった割と誰もやってなかったので誰もやってないところを違うジャンルの人が入って
When you examine the different animations Mario has while moving, you'll find most of them are actually quite comical. The skidding is very pronounced and exaggerated. The little kicks he does while swimming look funny, as does his crouching sprite. Even without comparing the animation to that of other games from the same time, it's pretty easy to see an appeal here. He even changes his expression when switching from mini to super to jumping while super. It's a small touch, but one that makes movement feel much more dynamic than it would otherwise. Also cartoony is the way he swings down the flagpole at every level. The implication here isn't that he's just sliding down the pole, it's that he's running the rope that moves the flag at the same time he's falling. This is about as cartoony of an action as you can get. Many of these animations do a good job of showing a sense of weight. When crouching, he's very rounded at the top and flat on the bottom, which helps give a sense of groundedness. While skidding, he swings his weight in a sort of upward angle as he turns. His walking and running sprites are the same, just at different speeds, and in both he swings his arms around quite a lot. All of this looks cartoony, all of it has a sense of weight, and even a sense of squash and stretch, one of the most fundamental principles of effective animation. The reason this principle is so effective is because it gives a sense of weight and flexibility to objects, and because it simulates the movement of natural musculature. Compared to the fluidity of animation in games today, Super Mario Bros. Is nothing to gawk at. But for a game of its time, it had some pretty impressive character animation, and to this day, that helps the game feel a lot more lively than it would without it. Let's talk about bouncing. There's a lot more to it than you would expect. First off, holding down the jump button makes no difference in how you bounce off an enemy. That's something that was only added in later games. The gravity value that is enacted each frame is equal to whatever your gravity value was when you landed on the enemy. Pressing A after hitting an enemy doesn't lower your gravity value like it normally does. The height you bounce actually changes depending on what kind of enemy you landed on. Goombas, Buzzy Beetles, and any kind of Koopa give you an upward velocity of 4 pixels and XXXX. with XXX being equal to whatever it was the frame before you landed on an enemy. Land on a Lakitu, Hammer Bro, Cheep Cheep, or Bullet Bill, and you get an upward velocity of 3 pixels, XXX. It seems like a small difference, but since some enemies only give you 3/4 the height of other enemies, it is perceptible if you're looking for it. If you aren't looking for it, it's probably not something you'll be conscious of. To quote a YouTube reviewer who's much more well known than I am, you may not notice it, but your brain does. Jump on an enemy without moving and you'll get some nice air. Jump on an enemy while at walking speeds, and you'll get about 12% higher on average. But land on an enemy at running speed, and you'll average only about 80% as high as a standing bounce. Maybe running bounces are lower to maintain a sense of horizontal movement, but I also believe a major factor in this is allowing Mario to bounce off of multiple enemies at different speeds. There are times in Super Mario Bros. Where the pacing is mostly dictated by the game. There is a timer after all, and you can't move backwards. But for the most part, the player has an immense amount of control over every playthrough, and really over almost every screen in the game. There's an undeniable sense of cause and effect throughout Super Mario Bros., and it's laid over a physics system that is deceptively intuitive while also maintaining a high learning curve. It's that old game design mantra of easy to learn, hard to master. Different parts of the game are complementary. Fun to move around, easy to pick up and play at any time, lots of replay thanks to being dynamically controlled by the player, and with an underlying tension that continues to build and release. It all comes together to create something very cohesive. The arcade experience at home. It's not a game that's meant to be played through as much as it is a toy that's meant to be played with, time and time again. If you asked someone who plays a lot of video games why Super Mario Bros. Is fun, they'd probably tell you it's the physics. Hopefully, after watching this video, you have a better understanding of why that is. Thanks for watching.